He was a starving artist, and God provided his daily bread. Jake Weidmann is coming up on episode 136 of Manly with Andy. Now joining the podcast is Jake Weidmann, who is a Renaissance man. He's a professional artist and certified as one of 9 master penmen in the world. A book which is so beautiful because it has his art in it. It's called Old Soul, New Creation, Experiencing God Through a Life of Art and Faith. Great coffee table book, if that's still a thing. I don't know. It's beautiful. It's on my coffee table. Anyway, Jake, let's start here with where I start every conversation. What do you think is the biggest challenge that men face today, and how do we overcome it?
There are some major challenges that men face today. And I think a lot of it is just not subscribing to a particular brand of manliness. I think that it's very easy in this high tension environment that we're in, both socially and politically, to either go to one extreme or in a reactionary way, go to another. And so I think finding the wholeness of what it actually means to be a man as the Lord really intended it to be, and as Jesus himself modeled that to be, I think is the greatest challenge that we have to face. There's many different minefields that we have to work around, but I think that you find the greatest path forward, the safest place is in relationship with God. And I think that comes so much through this idea of sonship. We have this incredible mantle given to us by God as sons and daughters of the one true King. So what does that mean to actually live into that mantle as a man, as a son of God, and walk with him? And so, what has been such a beautiful opportunity to really go back and look at my own story through this book is seeing all the ways that God has drawn close to me in those times. And even through the hardest points in my life, I always knew that I was his, that I was drawn into him, and my identity was secured so long as I knew well that I was the adopted son of God.
Let's jump into your story and in the book. So you admit right at the beginning that you're an artist, but it took you a long time to come to grips with the calling that God had on your life. So let's start with your journey to become an artist that was started in the spring of 1991, as you share.
Yeah, absolutely. I talk about art as the last thing I thought I'd ever do or make a living at, but it was still my first language and oldest friend. And so it was this ever-present thing, but I always kept it off to the side. It was peripheral thing long before God ever made it like my central calling in life. And like when I was a kid, I wanted to grow up. I wanted to be a cowboy. And so I used to draw pictures of horses obsessively. And then I grew out of that phase, and I thought I'd follow in my father's footsteps to become an Air Force pilot. And so I used to draw pictures of airplanes obsessively, and even did a huge 13-foot mural on my bedroom wall of a C-130. And that passion faded away, and I really found this love for psychology. And I thought the way that I'd bring my art along in that was to do art therapy. So art was always there, but as this side dish to the main thing that I was always pursuing. And it wasn't until I graduated college, I had this shiny new degree in psychology, and I thought I was going to go on to be a counselor working with kids. And but the only thing I could really get a job doing that was paying the bills was all of these random art commissions that kept coming my way. And so eventually it grew into something that started looking like a career. And by God's guiding hand, I was introduced to a couple of just really amazing men who looked at me and said, "Jake, you have this incredible gift, but you're bogged down, you're kind of all over the place, and we're going to really help build the infrastructure around you to undergird you as an artist in what we see God calling you into." And so for me, it was such a surprising thing that it was like, man, this is what I swore I would never do. I would be able to make a living as an artist. But it hasn't been easy. All stereotypes begin somewhere, and I've certainly lived the life of the starving artist from time to time, but in so doing, I found that my hunger for the Lord has grown more than anything.
Wow. A few different places I want to jump off from there. First off, you talked about that there was a few men that kind of came into your life and helped mentor you. And what did that look like? Because I think nowadays we're such islands as guys. We're siloed, especially when you think about people that are freelancers like you. We just, and even an artist and a creative, we just are all on our own. And so, how did you find mentors to come around you, and how did the process look like? And just talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think particularly as men, finding mentor relationships is critically important. Thankfully, that's something that was instilled in me by my own father, like very early on in life. In fact, there is a whole chapter of the book that's dedicated to that, to this idea of mentorship and legacy. And when I was a kid, when I was like a new teenager, my dad really loved the idea that he looked at Jewish tradition and saw that they have this bar mitzvah and this definitive time where it says you have become a man. So you now have all of the responsibilities and authority as a man, and that's given to you. So I think those rites of passage are critically important, and a lot of times they go overlooked, and that's what my dad thought. And so he said, what seems a little bit more befitting to our culture and our time is to have that be right at the age of 15. And so he essentially created this Christian bar mitzvah, if you will. He said, he came to us when we were 14, and he said, Jake, I want you to pick out 6 mentors to represent 6 different disciplines of a godly man. There has to be one to represent a man in his God, a man in his wife, a man in his family, a man in his ministry, a man in the world, not of the world, which is essentially a man in his vocation, and then one to represent a man in his friends. And he says, I have 2 rules that go along with this. The first is you cannot choose me for any one of them. I am your father, and I'm going to instill wisdom in you as much as I can, but it's very important that you learn to look outside of our relationship to seek wisdom and from many different mentors as you grow. The second rule is you have to choose your grandfather for a man in his family. So there's a passing of the generational blessing. And so I had to meet with each one of these men and bring these different questions that pertain to this discipline, and leading up to my 15th birthday. And then come my 15th birthday, we met in the morning as a group of men to discuss and bring out the full roundedness of what it means to actually be a man and keep all of these different disciplines in play. And then in the evening, there was a ceremony where each one of the men got up and told all of my friends and all of my family who was invited to attend what they had told me privately, so that I would be accountable publicly before everyone. And then they each prayed over me, and there was a passing of a different colored strand that was draped around my neck. And then in the end, my mom and dad, they read their own blessings over me, wove the cord together, and that represented the mantle of what it meant to be a man. So that's a long-winded answer to say that my love and discipline for seeking out mentoring relationships started very early on at a very critical period. And so while those mentors have faded from my life over time, I've still sought out other relationships. And so when it came time to actually build the business, I was hungry for it. I knew that there were things that I didn't understand about the business world, that I wouldn't gain through school. And so my ears were perked to it. And then sure enough, God brought around this one man by the name of Wes Roberts, who said, Jake, I see this gift in you and I want to see it grow. And then he actually led to others. He goes, you have needs that I can't meet in the form of true business infrastructure. So he brought in this dear man who's like another father figure to me, Steve, who helped build this business and give me a path forward. Because as much as I want to be a great artist, in order to do that, I also have to be a great businessman. I have to be a great entrepreneur. It's not enough to just create beautiful things. In the end, it's like what I create in the studio is sacred, but it has to go out into the world. It has to get a job in the marketplace. And so they really helped mentor me and show me that path forward, which was absolutely critical right at the time that I needed.
Let's talk about this, that you mentioned this too, that the starving artist stereotype is real for a reason, and you've had those moments in your life where you felt that way. Is there a time where you look back and you think, I was literally a starving artist and God gave me my daily bread? Do you have a moment where you just think, God, or maybe you even said to God, I don't know how I'm going to keep going? And how did God show up in that moment?
Yeah, it was the spring of 2018. We had moved out of our condo and bought a brand new house that was like really more than we could afford, but we were determined, my wife and I, to really grow our business because we were doing business at home. And so we took on this massive new home that was supposed to accommodate all and a growing family. My wife was pregnant with our second kid at the time. And so there we were, just kind of like overwhelmed. And then all of a sudden, like all of my commissions and everything just dried up as we had taken on all these new expenses. And so it was a time that I was really hungering after the Lord. And I think it was by no mistake that I was working on the hymn, His Eye is on the Sparrow. And I've done a series of hymns, doing them in this beautiful calligraphed form and illustrating the piece on calfskin vellum, the way that the old scribes used to write the ancient manuscripts. And so I was working on this hymn, and that was all that I had. And I was kind of out of pocket on it. It was just a passion project of mine that would eventually become a limited edition series of prints, but I still had a long ways to go on it. And so when we moved into our new home, I was in the middle of this, and we're just barely making ends meet, barely making our new mortgage payment month to month. And my wife was just stressed out, and she was like, how are we going to do this? We've made a massive mistake. And I was like, I usually pride myself. I'm usually one that can rally the troops, give a good locker room talk to my wife that we're going to go out there, we're going to take the field, God is with us. And everything that I said was just falling flat. And it was just, failing is one thing, but failing in the eyes of your wife is just brutal. And so I remember leaving that conversation with my wife. She went up to bed, and I went back to my studio to work on the one thing that I had, which was His Eye is on the Sparrow. And as I sat there staring at this piece, I just not feeling at all motivated to begin, I felt the prompting of the Lord saying, Jake, turn it over and pour your heart out to me. And it's the only time I've done this. Calfskin vellum has to be stretched over a piece of 3/4 inch plywood. You have to wrap the whole piece of plywood in acid-free paper, and then you stretch the skin and tack it up the side. It's almost like a small piece of furniture, but that's the way that it stays beautiful and pristine for hundreds of years to come. I took this calfskin vellum, stretched on the board, flipped it over, and I journaled a prayer on the back of this hymn saying, Lord, remind me of all the ways that all the miracles that you have done to bring us to this place. Remind me of how you parted the waters in order to make this home our promised land. And I was crying through it. My tear stains still mark the back of that piece. And so I dated the prayer and went to bed. And I went up, and I was still just laying, just anxious, still crying out to the Lord. And finally just gave out one last cry to God, before I went to sleep, God, just help me to see. And then it was in an instant, it was one of the clearest times I've ever heard the voice of the Lord in my life. Jake, Hannah has supported your passions for many years. It is now time to support her in hers. And then all of this sudden, this flood of this idea of Hannah starting her own venture, her own business just came to me. And so, I waited till the next morning, and now I was I couldn't sleep because of anxiety. And then I couldn't sleep because I was so excited to share it with Hannah. But I waited till the next morning. And that's a hard thing to tell your wife who's 6 months pregnant, already overwhelmed with a house, that she needs to start her own business. I waited for her to have her critical second cup of coffee, because she always says, I need one to wake me up and one to make me happy. So I waited for that cup. And then I pitched her on this idea, and it took her a while. At first, she pushed back against it. But eventually this smile came over her face. And to make a long story longer, she eventually scoped out this whole idea of a woman's jewelry brand. And I engrave and sculpt all of the individual pieces. She comes up with the ideas, and then I form them and put them out. And each one of them is beautifully laden with all of this gorgeous symbolism born from scripture, that is, placed around the neck of the wearer. And so for me, it was like this unbelievable moment of sort of casting my net on the other side of the boat. And then there on the other side, we found this whole new source of income, which, met our immediate need, but it grew the strength of my marriage in ways I never could have imagined, and gave my wife an opportunity to have a platform and a voice all her own to speak over God's beloved in the promises that they have, that he has given them in their life. So it was just, it was an incredible turn of events, one of the most powerful in my life, to see God, the great multitasker, accomplish so much when I had very little.
And then I think it's a really powerful story too in your book, talking about your commission about the old rugged cross. So if you want, and the journey you went through crafting that specific piece was that after this then?
Yeah. The cross came a little bit along. I mean, that was thankfully the jewelry business had picked up, and then some other commissions started coming along, and one of which was for another hymn piece. And so it was the old rugged cross. It was commissioned by this couple it was this older couple, and they had met in this small, one-room chapel singing hymns together. And they wanted to commission me to create a set of hymns that would ultimately be a permanent installation at Cedarville University. And one of their favorite hymns was the old rugged cross. And I had sketched out a couple of ideas on the morning that I went to go meet with them, but this one idea popped in my head for the old rugged cross, to not only do the whole hymn on calfskin vellum and heavily adorned in beautiful paint and gold leaf and all of that, but then have it set into a full-size cross, to carve everything, carve this framework around it that looks like it grew right there in this cross. So I pitched this idea to them, and they absolutely loved it. As it so often happens, I create these huge scopes of these art pieces that I hope people will like and will commission me for. And then afterwards comes okay, great. Now I have to actually make good on that promise. And so I want, for this cross, the critical part was, it's supposed to be the old rugged cross. And so I wanted wood that looked old. I wanted it to have a great deal of age to it. And you can distress wood, but oftentimes that looks a little cheap. I wanted something that, had survived the weather of time and had this incredible backstory all its own. And so I had searched and searched for the right wood. I was actually looking specifically for black walnut, because I knew that would contrast beautifully with the creamy white basswood that I was going to carve all of the vine work out of and be overlaid on the cross. And so I had searched and searched, and it was Good Friday of 2022. I wake up every morning and I journal. And so I journaled this prayer. I was like, Lord, I believe you've called me to do this piece. And I just ask that you would provide the material and make it abundantly clear, Lord, that this is what was intended for that piece. And so there was one salvage yard I hadn't checked yet. It was way out east in Colorado. So I went on this long drive in my pickup truck, and I show up at this lumber yard, and they get reclaimed lumber mostly from the Amish in the Midwest. And so I went through, and they had just stall after stall, bay after bay of just all different kinds of wood: hickory, oak, heart pine, cherry, but I didn't see any walnut. And so finally I met the proprietor of the wood yard, and he came out. His name was Mike. And I said, hey, do you by any chance have black walnut beams? I'm looking for black walnut. He goes, I might have a couple. Let's go look. And so there's this one bay, and underneath a whole bunch of other boards, here he pulls out this massive beam that has gorgeous age. It was black walnut, and it came from an Amish barn from the 1840s. If you actually did the math on in order for it to yield a beam that was that long, that straight, that thick, this thing would have sprouted during the time of the Reformation. So it was just this unbelievable piece of wood that had all this great story to it, but I needed one more cross piece, and we circled the yard many times looking for another piece of walnut. We came right back to the same bay, and there, standing up in the corner, we had missed it, but was another beam just a bit shorter than the first, and it was just enough to make my old rugged cross. And so I bent down and I picked up this great beam, and its pitted and splintery surface was against my cheek, and I'm like sweating in the hot sun. And all of this sudden it hits me the day that it is, and I start crying as I put this beam into the back of my truck, that here I am taking up my own cross on Good Friday. And Mike, the yard worker, like he saw me, he's like, "Whoa, Jake, are you okay? Did you pull out your back or something?" And and I was like, "No." I said, I told him what the piece was for, and he ended up being a super solid believer. I showed him the concept sketch. He starts crying. So two burly guys in a wood yard just crying together over God's provision. And so it will always be an amazing part of that story. And so we chronicled the whole creation of the piece in video, so you can see it on YouTube, The Old Rugged Cross by Jake Weidmann, and we had some friends that did a new rendition of the song for it. It's there in video, and now it's chronicled in the book. It's become this great Ebenezer of all the ways that God provided for that very special piece.
Yeah, check it out. Definitely in the book. The picture is so beautiful. One more question for you, Jake. You talk about this book and how it's for all of us, even those who don't consider ourselves a creative. I believe, and I know you do believe, that God has put creativity in all of our hearts in one way or another. So what would you say to the businessman, the manager that's listening to this podcast, driving to work thinking, I'm not going to lumber yards to get reclaimed wood to build crosses. I'm just sending 500 emails a day. How can they find creativity, God-given creativity in what they do?
I will say, I do think that everyone is creative. Not everyone is artistic. And so while I, as an artist, might substitute as a great archetype for creativity, the same human ingenuity that is alive in me and is animated whenever I put, quill to vellum, brush to canvas, or chisel to wood, that same capacity is alive and well in every single human being. And so I think that part of having the Imago Dei, the image of God pressed within us, means that we need to step into that creative capacity. And when we do so, that's when we find the most amazing relationship with God, that he shows up in the midst of our work. The Benedictine monks had a great Latin phrase for this. They said, laborare est orare, which means to work is to pray. And so I think if you frame everything, any type of work that you do, it is generative, it is creative. And so when you call upon the Lord and invite him into your work, even the mundane can be turned miraculous. And so that's where I really encourage, and it's something that is, now my life's message, is to call everybody to that, to not just be consumers, but creators. And in so doing, there's greater fulfillment in that. So it doesn't matter what you do, whether you are an entrepreneur creatively trying to figure out how to build and structure a business, whether you're a father and you're trying to figure out how to structure your home and raise your kids and serve your wife. All of that is drawn from this beautiful creative capacity that the Lord has given us. And whenever we step into that, we're made more in the likeness of our Father.
This can kill your faith. Jed Coppinger will share from his book, Fake Christianity, coming up next week on Manly with Andy.